George Will, a staunch conservative, has penned a scathing op-ed against Senator Josh Hawley, a Republican, and other congressional Republican lawmakers who have decided that they will challenge the electoral vote certification on January 6th. That's mostly a ceremonial event that is spearheaded by the Vice President, Mike Pence. And the whole point here is honestly to appeal to Trump's base, because Josh Hawley, there's no question, is eyeing a 2024 presidential race. Now, with that said, the op-ed written by George Will in the Washington Post, I have to hand it to him. I mean, I don't agree with him politically on most things. I agree with him on this matter, that's for sure. But very eloquently written. Pay close attention to what he's implying here. Hawley's conscience regarding electoral proprieties compels him to stroke this erogenous zone of the GOP's 2024 presidential nominating electorate. Hawley's stance quickly elicited panicky emulation from Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz, another 2024 aspirant. Cruz led 10 other senators and senators-elect in a statement that presents their pandering to what terrifies them, their Trumpkin voters, as a judicious determination. Hawley, has there ever been such a high ratio of ambition to accomplishment? And Cruz have already nimbly begun to monetize their high-mindedness through fundraising appeals. And that is something that we talked about on the show, how Ted Cruz was putting out advertisements on Facebook, for instance, asking for donations to help with these Senate runoff races. However, that money actually goes straight to Ted Cruz's pocket for campaigning in the future. So I love the fact that George Will has brought this up. And there are real consequences for this. Now, we've explained before, but I'll explain it again. Even with these Republican lawmakers challenging the electoral votes and questioning whether to certify, it doesn't matter. At that point, both the House and the Senate get to vote on the issue. And clearly, since Democrats control the House, it is incredibly unlikely, nearly impossible for the House to overturn the results of the general election. So these lawmakers have made a political calculation and they realized, well, we don't actually have to overturn the results of the election. We don't need to worry about that, but we can at least put our names out there as Trump loyalists because it'll help us out politically in the future. And I think that's a pretty disgusting thing to do. And that does have some consequences for the country. And I wanna bring you in, Ryan, to share your thoughts on this, because while it might sound like fun and games when it comes to the outcome of the general election, I think that there are some other consequences, including encouraging Republican voters to engage in violence because they genuinely think that this election was stolen from Donald Trump.
That's right. And so when you think about what Hawley and Ted Cruz and the others are up to here, you have to start asking whether or not the other consequences are intended or unintended. There's a generous reading that says, look, this is just a stunt. These are folks who are just trying to position themselves with Trump's base for the 2024 election. They're not really trying to undermine democracy. They're not trying to create violence in the street. But the undermining of democracy and the violence in the street that can be created by this is so predictable that you start to have to question that assumption. And then you look at the movement that Ted Cruz and Hawley have come out of. And it is, 40 years of pro-authoritarianism. There has not been an interest in the right wing of the kind of American political parties pretty much ever in having everybody vote, in expanding the franchise. The right wing has always had kind of a tenuous relationship with democracy, but in the 80s when throughout the 20th century you saw mass voter suppression, throughout the 19th century mass voter suppression, and so there is a real authoritarian strain. And so you have to wonder, is the undermining of democracy a feature or a bug? of what Hawley and Cruz and others are doing here. Do they, are they doing this, for electoral gain, but they feel a little bad about themselves? They feel like, what, we claim to be constitutionalists. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the Senate or a senator has any role whatsoever in counting in how the Electoral College determines who the president is. Nothing in there. In fact, quite the opposite. The 12th Amendment is very clear. Whoever has more electors shall be the president. That's it. There's no, if the Senate consents or advises. It's none of that. These guys are constitutionalists. They claim to be constitutionalists. So do they feel bad about that? You have to wonder. Are they actually eager to foment this, what we're seeing now, and to undermine democracy? Because for 40 years they have been trying to implement a minority rule system. They have known for a long time that kind of demographically and politically they would fade if you had everybody in the country voting, and so they've been trying to lock in place voting rules and judicial dominance that would allow them as a minority of the country to continue to dominate the majority. And so maybe this is kind of a piece of that.
I was reading this book regarding the power of the Republican Party, which I think is really important to look into. And the argument made in this book, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the author's name. The argument that was being made was that Donald Trump is actually an incredibly weak president because the system has been kind of set up in a way that helps the Republican Party get what they want, while also simultaneously pushing back against Donald Trump through the system, right? So a perfect example of that would be what just happened with the Pentagon budget. Donald Trump, of course, vetoed it, and both chambers of Congress stood up and, through unanimous consent, managed to pass a veto-proof a version of the NDAA, and then also, any issue that when you look at the public polling, public opinion, it's pretty easy for Republicans to get away with not representing the best interests of their constituents or what their constituents really want. But you make a really interesting point, and I think that since we have such short attention spans in the media, we quickly forget not just about the voter suppression that's taken place over the years, but the voter suppression that took place prior to Election Day. Prior to Election Day 2020, when you have Louis DeJoy dismantling the post office and ensuring that it was ill-equipped to process an influx of mail-in ballots. Now, luckily the post office did manage to get it done, but there was a lot of worry about that ahead of time. You had Donald Trump consistently, constantly sharing disinformation about mail-in ballots and discouraging people to vote by mail. Of course, you have issues like gerrymandering. Both parties do it. But Republicans have certainly done it more in a way to benefit them, with the way that these districts are drawn up. And even with all of those actions that took place prior to the 2020 general election, Joe Biden still managed to win. And what also kind of shocks me, Ryan, is the fact that the Republican Party seems to be totally delusional about how poorly Donald Trump has run this country, especially during a pandemic. When you have hundreds of thousands of people who have died as a result of the federal government, the executive branch's incompetence in response to this pandemic, of course people are not gonna be as supportive of you. What world are they living in? This is the result of the election, and it actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
Right, and they're living in a world where they're okay with that outcome as long as they can maintain a foothold in power. And your analysis is right on in the sense that the Republican Party is immunized in a lot of ways from public pressure because of the way that they're able to exert dominance in the Senate. People understand why. Every state gets 2, so they can win, in some scenarios, 35% of the vote. and still, maintain control of the Senate, even if they lose it tonight or after the votes are counted over the next few days. The path is pretty clear for them to retake it either in the next cycle or the cycle after that, and so they have a feeling that no amount of failure will allow them to fail. And if you can't lose, that's the ultimate political freedom. And so what they do with that freedom is unleash these forces on the democratic process itself. As they're going into 2018 midterms, for instance, if you recall, they were facing a tough House election. They were willing to throw away the House in order to get their $2 trillion plus tax cut through, because they know that there aren't really going to be consequences for them. Okay, so they won't control the House for a term or two, but for $2 trillion, that's worth it, because we're not going to be driven. We're not going to be driven fully from power, and that's a structural arrangement in a two-party system that you can't do anything about without developing a new system, because the two parties have to work together, and there's virtually no way for voters to thoroughly punish a party that so fully breaks from norms.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best ways they could is if there's enough organizing to be able to trigger rolling, general strikes. Once you start challenging the Capitol among their donors, I think that's when you have a different conversation. But I think as a country, we really need to have more detailed discussions about that, finding ways to apply pressure outside of the system, new ways of doing it that basically forces our elected lawmakers to represent our best interests. I want to go to a few other excerpts from George Will's piece, because I actually really appreciated a lot of what he had to say. There was a lot of strong language in there, not only to people like Josh Hawley and Louis Gohmert, but he also calls out Vice President Mike Pence. First, he writes that they know that every one of the almost 60 Trump challenges to the election has been rebuffed by state and federal courts, including the Supreme Court, involving more than 90 judges nominated by presidents of both parties. But for scores of millions of mesmerized Trump Republicans who think the absence of evidence is the most sinister evidence, this proves that the courts too are tentacles of the deep state. So, he's explaining a little bit of the ridiculous reasoning that goes on in the minds of Republican voters who just simply want their guy in office, even though he didn't win fair and square. And then in regard to Mike Pence, this really amused me. He writes, to fathom Pence's canine devotion to Trump, watch a video from June 7th, 2018, seated next to Trump in a meeting. Pence saw Trump take his water bottle off the table and place it on the floor. So Pence did likewise. And I had not seen this video. Apparently it went viral at the time. So of course I immediately looked for it. And he's absolutely right. Just take a quick look at this video.
We just unveiled a new strategic plan. It's not just a plan for FEMA, it's a plan for the whole community. It's a plan that I'd like to unify the federal government response, but also down through our state partners. We just unveiled a new strategic plan. It's not just a plan for FEMA, it's a plan for the whole community. It's a plan that I'd like to unify the federal government response, but also down through our.
So look, if that was just an isolated incident, it doesn't mean anything. But what I love about it is how that video symbolizes what we've seen among these so-called strong men within the Republican Party. Men who would puff up their chests as like the big tough guys who symbolize traditional masculinity. And then Donald Trump comes in, this incompetent buffoon, and they're so afraid of him that, I mean, it gets to the point where he can literally call your wife ugly and you'll end up phone banking for him. It's amazing.
And not just phone banking for him. The arc of that particular relationship is absolutely astounding. Starting from that moment to Cruz now leading an effort in Congress to overturn the election.
It's crazy.
It's one thing to phone back and raise money for the guy. This is a guy who has memorized the Constitution. and will tell anybody he meets that he has memorized the Constitution, and it is the thing that he cherishes above all else, except apparently one thing, and that's devotion to Donald Trump, the man who, like you said, mocked his wife as ugly, said that his father was involved in the JFK assassination. Who Cruz, if famously, remember, he refused to endorse Trump, from the podium at the Republican National Convention. Got all these jeers and boos and stood through it. But then when he saw that Trump was actually now powerful, all of it melted away. His principles and all of the personal insults that have been thrown his way.
It's just a sight to see. So I mean, I don't know. If I were campaigning as a Democrat, I would definitely point that out and mock them on a regular basis, because they certainly are not who they represented themselves to be. They're not strong men. In fact, all it takes is someone like Donald Trump for them to fold, because they're so afraid of his base.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.